Hello there. I would like to talk to you about a book that Friedrich Nietzsche wrote in his early days. It's one of his first major publications, although he had published other philological studies and some writings on the pre-Socratic philosophers. This was his first major work. It's called The Birth of Tragedy. And it has various editions. The one edition, the subtitle of that book was Out of the Spirit of Music. So this is a book called The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music. Another subtitle that he had in another edition was Hellenism and Pessimism. And so let's just talk about the title of the book, and then I'd like to point out 7 themes of that book. And as you read the text, you can look for these themes and mark them in your margins of your book. You know, I was in college for so long. I got my doctorate in 1984 at Penn State, and I was so lucky to get in there. They were ranked like 3rd in the world in philosophy, continental philosophy, and all my teachers were famous and so on. So I was had very good experience there. But over the 13 years that I was involved in higher education, I learned some tricks about studying, especially primary texts in philosophy and in any discipline. What you want to do is look for things. It's sort of like a scavenger hunt. You know, you're looking for something. So if you can find out what are the main themes of a particular text, then as you read, you can focus on those and look for those kinds of things and pay more attention to that. And then you can organize your notes around that. And there's nothing wrong with asking the teacher, what are the main themes of this book? Or even if you don't have a teacher, you can check some secondary texts and see if you can find some main themes of the book. And for that, you could look to the title of the book, like I want to talk about in a moment, or the tables of contents, the structure of the book. But if you can find the main themes, then you can look for those themes. And as you're reading, you can let a lot go and look for those themes. So I'll tell you what I think are the 7 major themes of this book, The Birth of Tragedy. But let me first talk about the title of the book. So the title of the book is quite straightforward. It's called The Birth of Tragedy. But I want you to understand the full purport of that. What Nietzsche is talking about here is the origin of ancient Greek tragic theater, which is the origin of theater. And this was not just another art form or a form of entertainment for the Greeks. This was like a major art form. In fact, Aristotle, in the first treatise we have on the philosophy of art, in his Poetics, he focuses on tragedy and comedy because many people believed that that was the highest form of art. There are other forms of art, of course. There's literature, there's painting, there's sculpture and music and all kinds of arts. But Aristotle and Nietzsche agree on this point that for the Greeks, for the ancient Greeks, tragic and comic theater were like the highest art forms because they included many other forms of art. But Nietzsche and Aristotle disagree on many points, and so there's really no reason to compare them at this point. All right, so the title of the book is The Birth of Tragedy. So it's quite straightforward. He's talking about the origin, the historical origin of tragic theater among the Greeks. But please try to understand the full purport of that. What grew out of that? Theater, the whole history of theater, Shakespeare, I mean, every theater, which is still around today. But the whole idea of people going onto a stage and acting gave rise to opera, and there are tragic operas, comic operas, and of course film is an outgrowth of theater. So all of these things, the whole idea of people pretending to be somebody else and creating an art form called tragedy and comedy. I remember I was 7 times in Greece, and I would spend like the whole summers there and present papers at conferences on the International Association for Greek Philosophy that usually would come at the end of the summer. But while I was in Greece, I would visit these amphitheaters, which are strewn throughout the Greek world, in the islands and on the mainland. And some of them, not many, but some, they actually enact the ancient tragedies by Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus. Those three names you should remember: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These are like the three main tragic writers of ancient Greece. Then they had comedies too. Aristophanes was a famous comic writer, and we have many of his plays today, and people enact them, directors enact them even today. So they're quite, I wanted to share that with you because they're quite awesome when you visit there. There are usually these amphitheaters. They're put up in the mountains overlooking the sea and the mountain, the Greek landscape. And there's usually a facade there of a temple, and then a place for the people to sit. One place called the Pidavros, I remember distinctly going there, watching a play, Electra by Sophocles. And you can hear, there, of course, you don't need microphones. You can hear in the back row people whispering on the stage. So fine is the acoustics. So these are truly amazing art forms, equal to Shakespeare or anything. Okay, and this was an important form of entertainment and pastime and art for the ancient Greeks. And of course, like I just said, it gave rise to all of those wonderful, the whole history of theater, opera, and film, and so on. The subtitles of these books, the first, Out of the Spirit of Music, we need to, I'll refer to that later when we start talking about music and the Dionysian, because music was part of these tragedies. You see, the tragedies were performed by the ancient Greeks as a performance, not to be read like we read them today sometimes, but they're actually performed sometimes today by directors and so on. But people read them too and use their imaginations. But when they were enacted and produced, there was an orchestra, and they would play, of course, different instruments than they use today, probably the lyre, drums, flutes, and different instruments that the ancient Greeks used. And they were all put to meter, and the Greeks would wear masks, and and the masks would be part of the persona. In fact, that's where the word personality comes from, the word persona, which means the mask that the Romans would use in copying the Greeks in their tragedies and comedies. So let's talk about the subtitle of the second edition of the book, Hellenism and Pessimism. Hellenism is simple. It just means the ancient Greeks. But you should know that for Nietzsche, unlike many of his colleagues, and Nietzsche belonged at the time that he wrote this book, he was only 27 years old. The book is not really reflective of his later style of writing. Nietzsche's a very good writer. This one's a little bit over the top, a little bit over a romantic. In fact, he even criticizes that style later on when he reflects back on his earlier works. But he doesn't renege on the ideas. He still believes that the ideas that he had were sound, and they're absolutely original ideas. We'll talk about those in a moment. So what does he mean by Hellenism and pessimism? Well, I told you, by Hellenism, he simply means the ancient Greeks. Now, for Nietzsche, he thinks that the early period was the pinnacle of the Greek world, unlike most of his colleagues and most Greek scholars, in fact, who believe that the classical period is the pinnacle. You see, they usually divide the ancient Greek world into three periods. They do that with every epoch, but there's the early, the middle, and the late period. The early period is called the Archaic period. So that's the time of the pre-Socratic philosophers around the 6th century BC, all the way back as far as you can go, including Homer, and it goes back like to 1600 BC among the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, which are the earliest peoples that we know of in ancient Greece. When you start moving into the 5th century BC, the time of Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. That's called the classical period. That's called the Hellenic period. And then after Aristotle and Alexander the Great, um, that's called the Hellenistic. So it's archaic, Hellenic, and Hellenistic. And the art changes. If you take a course in art history, you'll see the style changes, the columns change, and things change. But Nietzsche believed that the early period was the pinnacle. When you come, by the time you get to Euripides, who was a later tragic writer, who was a contemporary of Socrates, then we are already on the downslide. It's the decline. So most people don't believe that way. So Nietzsche, you'll see when you're doing the reading, you'll see him lauding the early period, the time of Aeschylus and Sophocles. By the way, there's many other tragedians and comic writers besides Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, hundreds, if not thousands. But these are the three names that have come down to us as the most famous, and Nietzsche will speak of them at length in the book. So that's what he means by Hellenism. He means the Greeks, generally speaking. But remember, he thinks that the early period was the pinnacle. The next part, pessimism, needs a little commentary. I won't go into it in detail, but there was another philosopher who came before Nietzsche. His name was Schopenhauer, and his school of thought is called pessimism. You know what the word pessimism means. Usually the pessimist sees the negative side of things and the optimist sees the bright side of things, right? The cup is half full or half empty. And the pessimist sees it as half empty. But Schopenhauer is a deep and great thinker, and Nietzsche took him very seriously. His main work was called The World as Will and Representation, but he wrote many other things, wonderful things in aesthetics, the philosophy of art, and so on. But the road that Schopenhauer takes is called pessimism, because he wants to articulate the horrible and terrible character of existence. And Nietzsche believed that these ancient Greeks were pessimists in the deep sense of the word, not just that they saw that they were going around brooding and seeing the negative side of things all the time, but they didn't look at the world with rosy colored glasses. They were not optimists, okay? They were pessimists. In fact, as we'll see in a minute, he connects optimism with science and the birth of the scientific and theoretical mentality. We'll talk about that later. Well, since I mentioned it, perhaps I should clarify just a little bit. The reason he identifies optimism with science is because science believes that it can know everything. That if it doesn't know something, that someday it will know something. So there's this belief in reason, and Nietzsche's not completely against that. It's just that he has a healthy skepticism and a critique of science, which is it's not even close to this denial of science that's pervasive today. That's a completely different thing. That's La La Land. That's something else. There can be a critique of science without being, a denial of science. That's another thing. All right, let's not get into that. All right, so back to Nietzsche's book. So by pessimism, he means that these early Greeks, that's important, not the classical period of Plato and Aristotle or later on in the Hellenistic times, the early period, the archaic period that gave birth to tragedy and comedy and the pre-Socratic philosophers, which Nietzsche loved, they were pessimists. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that they saw the horrible, the terrible, the enigmatic character of existence. Okay, I know that sounds horrible. I always laugh when I think about that because you all are so young and there's no reason you need to be thinking about, did you ever know that you're going to die, right? We all know that, but that's pretty horrible stuff. And, here now I'm an old man, and just yesterday I was your age, so time just flies by like crazy. I mean, there's two perspectives. Sometimes life seems like it's very long. The days just go on slowly. I mean, sometimes it just goes like a flash, but there's the brevity of human life, which is a horrible thing. And then there's pain and suffering and loss. I mean, I don't want to dwell on this too much because that's like Debbie Downer, but it's true, right? Whatever you love will leave you or you will leave it one day. So that's horrible. And that's just built right into time. Time passes, and because it passes, everything born will die. And so that's how it is. All right. So that's what he means by the horrible. And by terrible, he means there's pain and suffering, and that good people suffer, bad people prosper sometimes. And there's no way of, and by enigmatic, you know what enigma means? That's a good word for you if you don't know the word. An enigma means that it's completely inexplicable. You can't explain it. There's no reason why. That there's, for example, there's things happen, and no matter what you do, sometimes you can't sidestep that. It just happens. It's enigmatic. The way I like to think about it is that the human mind is finite. So when it reaches out as far as it can only go so far. It's like a candle in the night, and the light can only shine so far. And then after the light, there's maybe some halo around the light, and then blackness, right, surrounds that light. And that's how consciousness is. It can only reach out so far, and then there's this enigma, there's this mystery that pervades human existence. That's what he means by enigmatic. So all of that he groups together as pessimism. Okay, and in pointing to that, he points out that there was a myth in ancient Greece in the early period, and the myth. I'm trying to think of the name of the person in the myth now. It eludes me right now, but it was an associate of Dionysus in the myth. We're going to speak at length about the Dionysian in a minute. I'll have to remember it later. But anyhow, Nietzsche refers to this myth. There's an associate of Dionysus that was asked, what is this wisdom of Dionysus? What's the greatest thing that humans can have? And his name almost came to me, but it doesn't matter. A little rust as you get older. It's part of the horrible character of existence. Anyhow, he says, the best thing for humans is not to be born. The second best thing is to get out of existence as soon as possible. So that's about the most negative thing that anyone can say about existence, right? About life. And Nietzsche points to that, showing that these Greeks were pessimists, that they saw the horrible, terrible, enigmatic character of existence. Now, here's the rub. This is the important part, so don't pass by this. He says all this in the introduction to his book, in the preface, I'm sorry. Silenus. Yes, that's his name. That's the companion of Dionysus that goes into the myth. See, myths reflect truth. So we use the word myth as though it's false, but if you can understand myths, they reflect a kind of truth that pervades a people. That's another thing. That's called poetic truth, where myth is not just something false. I mean, people use it that way. That's one way, common way of understanding myth. But another way of understanding myth is if you can understand the meaning of the myth, it reflects the worldview of a people. So that's why Nietzsche picks that myth to speak about pessimism among the early Greeks. He wants to point out to his audience that these Greeks were pessimists, these early Greeks, that they saw the horrible, terrible, enigmatic character of existence. Now, here's the rub. This is the important point. He also says that these early Greeks were saying yes to life more fully and more fervently than any other people he's ever studied. And Nietzsche was a student of culture. Nietzsche's a genius. I mean, I'm not the only one to say this. I mean, he is to philosophy what Beethoven is to music, okay? I mean, and he's recognized as that now. And I wouldn't have taken on this time in my life to study Nietzsche so carefully if I had thought he was short of that. So in all of his studies of cultures of the world, these Greeks were saying yes to life. They had this doctrine of the love of life more deeply than any other people. And I must testify, when I went there, it's to Greece, those 7 times, and you go to the museums and you see the artifacts and you go to the monuments and you can feel this affirmation, this yes to life. So how is it that these two things can be in the same people, that they were pessimists and at the same time affirming life more fully than anyone? This is the thing that Nietzsche wants to think about. Well, the answer to that, as a spoiler, is going to be it was through their invention of tragic and comic theater that they were able to overcome pessimism, take the next step beyond pessimism and to what he calls this tragic affirmation of life. It's tragic because it says yes to life even though there's suffering and death and enigma and horrible things happen. It says yes to life nonetheless, even despite the fact that there's such a thing as finitude and passing. So that's what he means by pessimism, Hellenism and pessimism. They went beyond it. They took the road of pessimism, but they went beyond pessimism. They took the next step into this tragic affirmation of life. And this is what attracts me to Nietzsche, this yes to life that's at the heart of all of his works and his thinking. So let me go over these. I found like 7 themes that pervade this book, The Birth of Tragedy. One, the last one, the 7th one, is sort of my own idea of taking Nietzsche and doing something original with it. The first 6 are just in Nietzsche, okay? And so you can do what I started talking about, like in my years at college, I found little tricks, you know, to do well in school, and it got easier because my mind got stronger, but I found these little bag of tricks, you know, of studying, how to study. You know, you learn how to study. And you find joy in learning, actually, that's important too. But one of the little tricks I found was just make a little lexicon for yourself. If you know the 7 major themes of a book, then make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and make a lexicon. Number 1 means the Dionysian, that's what I'm going to say. Number 2 means the Apollinian, and go on and make all 7. And then in the margins of your book, just whenever he's talking about the Dionysian, put number 1 there. Whenever he's talking about the Apollonian or Apollinian, people use both expressions, put number 2 there. So you'll have like a little lexicon in your book, and and then you can gather all those places together. You know what he's talking about. Now Nietzsche doesn't talk about things in a linear way. He doesn't talk about the Dionysian and the Apollinian. You know, he'll jump around and look at the same thing from another perspective. When I talk about themes animating a particular text, it means these are the main themes, but it's not going to come in a kind of ordinal fashion. First this, then that, and then that. It's going to come in a haphazard way. That's why it's good to have a little lexicon. Or you can underline, you can do it however you want, but these are what I find to be the major themes. Okay, so that's the title of the book. Now let's go over the 7 themes. Well, the first one is called the Dionysian. Now what Nietzsche does is, there was a god in ancient Greece, and his name was Dionysus. And he was a very earthy god. And Nietzsche took the name of that god, Dionysus, and turned it into a kind of adjective noun. He calls it the Dionysian. And so he coins his own word. He calls it the Dionysian. Now, what is the Dionysian? Well, for Nietzsche, the Dionysian is a compulsion, okay? An impulse. And it's in nature, it's in the animals, and it's in humans. Now, one of the places where Nietzsche deviates from traditional philosophy is that he believes that humans are animals, okay? We're different from all the other animals, but we belong to that genus of animals. Like Aristotle said, humans are rational animals. But the animality of humans is a theme that Nietzsche will talk about. Okay, so among the animals and in nature and in the animal nature of humans, there's what we call the Dionysian. And the Dionysian is the compulsion to frenzy. I know that sounds so weird, but by frenzy, he means excessive energy. Like, I don't know if you've ever felt it, like spring fever, for example. After you've studied hard and you take a little, people take a little break, they go where it's warm and they let off some steam, right? Too much energy. Think of excess. That's the key word. Actually, of all the elements of the Dionysian, excess is the key word. And this is a theme that hardly anyone's ever talked about, not even Charles Darwin, who thought very deeply about nature. You know, modern biology is dominated by Darwinian biology, but Nietzsche has a long, there have been books written on Nietzsche and Darwin. I have them in my library. And Nietzsche has a critique of Darwin. It doesn't come from the side of creationism and evolution. That's a false dilemma. You can answer that question by just saying God invented, God created evolution, and then the whole problem is solved. 3 words: God created evolution, and that's it. No, Nietzsche's critique of Darwin was that he didn't see the excess of energy in life, in nature. He saw only how things adapt to nature, natural selection, which is true. There are reactive forces in life, but there's also active forces. So associate the Dionysian with active forces. Active forces don't need anything to react to. They emerge out of an excessive force. Have you ever seen a litter of puppies? You know, I'm a dog lover, dog trainer, and dog handler, and I got serious about dogs. And when you are around puppies, for example, they're just a bundle of energy. Or go to a nursery school. It's just too much energy, right? Or listen to a bunch of birds chattering, or listen to the Italians when they get together, when they're traveling. It sounds like those birds who are all chattering together. And what's happening is they're just discharging energy, too much energy. Okay, that's the Dionysian. See, what I want you to do is make associations between the Dionysian and what Nietzsche associates with Dionysian. Don't make your own associations. You want to find out what Nietzsche associates with the Dionysian, what he means by the Dionysian. So I'm telling you, it has to do with excess, it has to do with discharging energy. It's a compulsion to frenzy. What else is the Dionysian? Well, before I tell you what else it is, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing, I'm going to let you do that, but it's a major force within art, okay? And it's going to be in the tragedies for Nietzsche. It's going to be in all art forms, and it's going to be in people too. It's in nature too, okay? It's called the Dionysian. So you want to be able to identify what Nietzsche associates with the Dionysian, so you can find out what he means by that. That's going to be very important. It's going to help you understand Nietzsche's view of art and Nietzsche's view of self-realization, which is going to be what we're going to focus on. So what else is the Dionysian? It has to do with forgetting. That sounds weird because nobody wants to be forgetting. I wrestle with that myself. When you get old, you start getting a little rusty. Like I forgot the word Salinas, but finally came back to me. But there's 2 kinds of forgetting. One forgetting comes out of a weakness. Like you should remember something. Like I'm trying to learn the words of Brazilian Portuguese samba and bossa nova songs so I can play, you know, and it's hard for me to, because I don't know Portuguese. I'm just memorizing nonsense syllables and it's hard to remember that. And I struggle with that, but I'm waiting for my books now. I'm gonna learn Portuguese. So, you know, that's the forgetting that comes out of weakness. Okay, you don't want that. You want your memory to be strong. But there's another kind of forgetting that Nietzsche talks about. This is unique to Nietzsche. I've never seen it in anyone else. It's the forgetting of strength. And what he means by that is, as you go through life, there's going to be humiliating things. There's going to be failures that happen. In fact, Freud points out that just being a child is humiliating because you're like smaller than everyone and everyone's telling you what to do. And but just as you go through life, you're going to struggle and fail sometimes. And so those people who can take those traumas and forget them, by forgetting, he means, it doesn't mean that you don't remember it anymore. You might remember, but you've left the emotional baggage. It's not weighing on you anymore. You've let it go. Okay. And there can be no cheerfulness without forgetting. Think about that. If you can't forget, you can't be cheerful. In fact, if you think about it logically, there could be no being in the moment if you can't forget the past. Have you ever met people, a lot of older people, because they've lived longer, they have more baggage, and sometimes it becomes even comical. They have so much baggage, they don't even see reality anymore. What they see is reality colored by the trace memories that are in their unconscious, and it distorts the reality. If it gets real extreme, you start living in an unreal world. You see that in politics today among some people who believe in outrageous conspiracy theories. We won't go there. It's comical. The comedians don't even have to do anything. They just have to say what other people say, and it's ridiculous. So that's called forgetting. He means it like, have you ever gone to a party or to a dance where you're feeling a little self-conscious, and maybe someone says, come on, let's go out and dance. Oh no, I'm not a very good dancer, blah, blah, blah. And you're, what's holding you back? You're too self-conscious. You think everyone's looking at, no one cares about you anyhow. I mean, no one's looking at you, and it's just a subjective kind of, you're thinking about yourself too much. So as time goes by, perhaps you start forgetting and you start enjoying yourself. You get with it, you start dancing. And by the way, this is important. It's not by the way, but I'm just saying things that occur to me. Dance and music are the two most Dionysian art forms. And both dance and music are part of the ancient Greek tragedies. Okay, because the chorus moved in choreographic movements and there was music there. So music and dance are part, and there's more to the Greek tragedies and comedies that are Dionysian, but the music and dance are the most Dionysian art forms. So it has to do with excess. It's a compulsion to frenzy. It's in all art, but the art that expresses it most purely are dance and music. What else about it? What else about the Dionysian? It has to do with animality. I mentioned that in passing, but human animality and animals are more Dionysian, okay? Because the reason is not, the rational part is not inhibiting the Dionysian forces. It also has to do with destruction. Wherever there's creation, there's destruction for Nietzsche. These are two sides of the same reality, okay? So whenever a new form is coming, it obliterates the last form. So it has to do with destruction. But insofar as it has to do with destruction, it's connected to creation. And it has to do with the annihilation of the principle of individuation. Like, instead of being this person, I forget about myself and I can become anybody. That's why, for example, in Dionysian states, like Halloween, where people are celebrating, they wear masks. If you trace the history of Halloween, All Hallows Eve and so on, it goes back to mask wearing. And so if you think about theater and even film today, or art form, theater, opera, people pretend to be somebody else. Have you thought about that? As children, we just do it very naturally. We pretend really easily. So what's happening when we pretend to be somebody else? We're annihilating our own individuality, becoming somebody else. And that's at the heart of this art form, right? Of tragedy, comedy, of theater, of film, actors, actresses. They turn it into a great art form. Some are really good at it. Okay, so it has to do with the annihilation of the principle of individuation, of destruction, forgetting, excess, animality. I'm going to stop there because I'll go on for hours talking about the Dionysian. I'm going to leave it up to you. So just go through the text. Whenever he's talking about the Dionysian, mark it. Put a number 1 there or some symbol there so you'll know. There's more to it than that. But I've said enough, and I want you to do the rest on your own. Now, that's going to be an important thing for self-realization. And we'll talk about that later when we come to the 7th theme. But remember that the Dionysian is going to be part of all art for Nietzsche, and it's going to be in the tragic theater. So he'll talk about that throughout the text, here and there, and you should try to gain as full understanding of what he means by the Dionysian as possible. Don't stray too far from this notion of excessive force. Have you ever seen dogs like do zoomies around them? My old dog, she's 14, she just did it the other day and it made me so happy, like a little puppy. I call it zoomies, where they get crazy and they run all over the place. That's it, that's the Dionysian, okay? Or Woodstock. I think, that's a cultural expression of the Dionysian. By the way, before I leave the Dionysian, all the great festivals of life, the great banquets of the Romans and the Vikings and the Celts, the banquets, the feasts, the celebrations, even if within Christianity, the celebrations, that's all Dionysian, okay? At weddings and so on. All right, so there's the Dionysian. Now, there's another compulsion in art. By the way, before I go on, this is not just in art, it's in culture too. You can focus on culture and find the Dionysian, or what I'm going to talk about now, the Apollonian, or sometimes it's called the Apollinian. It's from the god Apollo, who's the god of light, like the sun for the ancient Greeks. Now Nietzsche will take that word Apollo and make this adjective, noun, verb, it's hard to put a part of speech to it. He'll call it the Apollinian. And this is the compulsion to dream, all right? All art is dream work. This is very insightful on Nietzsche's part. When we go to bed at night or we're daydreaming, we're creating something, right? The imagination is forming images, deforming images, combining images, and we're creating a narrative, creating images. So art is dream work. The artist is a dreamer. Like all these tragedies and comedies, the tragedians and the comic writers dream them up. The operas that were written, the music that's composed, these are all dreams. And when you dream, you know you're dreaming. That's called lucid dreaming. To a greater or lesser degree, it's a matter of degree. Sometimes you can be dreaming and be fully aware that you're dreaming. It's an incredible state to be in. And that's the state of the artist. So the compulsion to dream. Now, in many ways, the Apollinian is the opposite of the Dionysian, where the Dionysian is connected with chaos. I didn't mention chaos. The Dionysian is connected with, I mentioned destruction, which accompanies chaos. But the Apollinian has to do with order, okay? And the Greek concept of beauty, and anybody's concept of beauty, is good form. I mean, there's people emphasize that even more sometimes. Like we were studying Kant, for example, who emphasizes form. When something has good form, what Kant called purposiveness without purpose, where it has a good form, then it's beautiful. Like a beautiful face. If the eyes are too close or too far away, if the nose is too big or too small, then it's not a beautiful face. It has to do with symmetry. So the Apollinian has to do with good form, has to do with beauty, has to do with order, has to do with self has to do with self-consciousness, memory. Know thyself. There's a temple in ancient Greece. When my first trip to Greece, I went there because I knew it was an important place. It's called Delphi. Some people say Delphi. I said Delphi when I went there, and I was corrected right away. It's Delphi. And it was a major religious center in ancient Greece. It was an oracle there, and people would come and consult the oracle. And the god that presides at Delphi was Apollo. And at the temple where the Pythia sat, the priestess who would become possessed by Apollo and give answers to these queries that people would ask the oracle, it's inscribed at the temple, know thyself. So self-knowledge is connected with the Apollonian, just like forgetting yourself is connected with the Dionysian. It's also connected with prophecy, because the oracle there at Delphi would prophesize the future, and that's going to be important. So it has to do with good form. It has to do with the shining of the individual, where the Dionysian has to do with the destruction of the individual. The Apollonian has to do with the shining forth of the limits of the individual. Like if you read Homer and you encounter Achilles in the Iliad, then he shines as the great warrior that he is. And he's the valor of all valiant men, and he shines forth as Achilles, or any actor who shines distinctly as his personage. So that's the Apollonian, the compulsion to dream, the shining forth of the individual, has to do with self-knowledge, know thyself. It has also to do with not transgressing limits. I didn't mention this when I mentioned the Dionysian, which I should have. It has to do with transgressing limits. I did mention it in passing in talking about the mask and the obliteration of self-identity, but it has to do with, like in society, there are limits. Men are men, women are women, but you can, in Halloween, for example, men dress up like women. In the ancient Greek tragedies, the men would dress up, would become women in the tragedy, for example. It's not just men and women. Kings become plebes. Plebes become kings, and it has to do with the shining of the individual. It has to do with not, the Apollonian has to do with self-identity. The Dionysian has to do with the destruction of self-identity. So that's the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Okay, the main thing about the Apollonian is the compulsion to dream. The main thing about the Dionysian is the compulsion to frenzy. Now, so those are the first two themes that you should be looking for. Try to, and I didn't go, I wasn't exhaustive, there's more. You want to find as many associations that Nietzsche makes with these concepts so that you can understand what he understands, what he means by that, okay? Leave yourself out of it for now. Just try to find out what Nietzsche means by the Dionysian and the Apollonian. Now, the next two themes, 3 and 4, are simply the Dionysian and the Apollonian apart from each other. So number 3 theme is the Dionysian independent of the Apollonian. Now think about that. If you have destruction, cruelty, animality, too much energy, frenzy, self-forgetting, overfull and overflowing feelings, which include anger and wrath and destruction, that doesn't sound like a very good thing, does it? It's a witch's brew of sexuality and cruelty. So the Dionysian, apart from the Apollonian, is a dangerous thing. Okay? And prisons are full of people who have committed crimes of passion. And if you look at history, sometimes there are eruptions and times in history where the Dionysian reigns freely without the Apollinian. Like, for example, for some reason, Nietzsche doesn't mention, I think it's because of his love of the Romans, but if you look to the latter part of the Roman Empire, the time of the Colosseums and Caligula, I don't think you can think of a more cruel time that pervade, the more barbaric time that pervaded a people. I mean, it's one thing to watch the movie, to watch a movie about gladiators, right? It's one thing. There was a great movie. It was pretty good, actually. It's called Gladiator. Um, it's one thing to watch that movie. It's another thing to sit in the audience and to watch gladiators being eaten up by lions, right? On Christians being eaten up by lions. Um, and the most horrible things, it's unspeakable what went on there. And the emperors like had to do that or the people wouldn't vote for them. So, but Rome wasn't like that the whole time. It's just at the end. So Rome gets a bad rap because of the end. But the Roman Republic was probably one of the pinnacle times of Western civilization. We're so far from that kind of republic now. The Romans of those days would laugh. They'd make comedies of what's going on now. But so Rome wasn't always decadent, but the decadent time at the end. But that's the Dionysian without the Apollonian, without the Apollinian. Okay, and that's one example. There are many examples throughout history. I mean, watch the series Vikings, which was pretty well done actually. Parts of it get boring, but parts. I mean, they would just plunder. They would just go and like. I mean, I know it's a film and it's a series, but those things are done on the basis of historical reference and so on. They would just go and plunder, and if they want, and the Romans did it too. They would just go there and defeat a people, take everything, and come back with a bounty, put the king in a cage, and have a triumph through the forum. And so that's the Dionysian without the Apollinian, and there are people that way, individuals. Nietzsche moves seamlessly between the individual and culture. Okay. And then the fourth, so there'll be times when he doesn't talk too much about that, but it's important to pay attention to that and to find at least some of that. There's mostly on the Dionysian in general, the Apollinian in general, and then find those places where he talks about the Dionysian without the Apollinian. Then find those places where he talks about the Apollinian without the Dionysian. Now that is just the opposite. That's a time in culture, for example, where there's too much rules. And a good example of that is from a film, Alice in Wonderland, the Tim Burton version, but any version, the Victorian period of England is a time, Nietzsche doesn't talk about this because it's not really part of what he's doing there. But if he wanted to come up with an example of the Apollinian without the Dionysian, Victorian England would be the perfect example. The time when Alice in Wonderland was written. But Nietzsche talks about Doric culture. In ancient Greece, there was a time when the Apollinian reigned without the Dionysian, among the Spartans and among the Doric peoples. And it was a very regimented period. Any transgressions of the limits of culture and of mores was considered immoral. Anything beyond, in Victorian England, for example, to come to a more contemporary times, anything that transgressed the limits of what was considered civilized, all too civilized, was considered madness and evil. Anything that transgressed the limits that they had set was considered evil. So it's a very uptight, and there are people that way who are very regimented, who don't concede to anything Dionysian. Okay. So that's the Apollinian without the Dionysian. And that's dangerous too, because what happens is what we learn from Freud and from psychology, depth psychology, is the Dionysian doesn't go away. If you put a top on the pressure cooker, if you don't have a little valve for that steam to discharge itself, it will explode like a hand grenade. Okay, so same thing happens with the psyche, which is a dynamic thing. If you have the superego or something very, the conscience, not consciousness, the conscience, it's too strong, and guilt and bad conscience, and the Apollonian without the Dionysian too strong, it creates a pressure cooker. And the Dionysian is not going to go away. If it did, you'd be dead because it's life. And so now it's going to create like a force. And now, as soon as there's any opening, pow, it'll explode. For example, in Victorian England, it was considered completely immoral to go off into the town at night, into the cabarets, and to drink. And the gentlemen of aristocracy, they would do it nonetheless. And if they were caught in those places where there were dancing girls and they were just considered to be evil. There's a movie, two movies actually, that were focusing on that. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Sometimes I would use that in my film class, where Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde because Dr. Jekyll, he's a civilized English gentleman, a famous doctor, but he drinks this potion, which is probably a metaphor for a drink, for alcohol, and then he would become this monster. And the monstrosity he became was a sexual predator and aggression and sexuality. By the way, the Dionysian is connected with sexuality too. Okay, so those are the first four: the Dionysian, number one; the Apollonian, number two; the Dionysian without the Apollonian, number three; the Apollonian without the Dionysian, number four. And the 3 and 4 are dangerous. One is overtly dangerous, the Dionysian, and the Apollonian is dangerous because it's a repressive and pressure cooker. Freud talked about repression is unconscious, and when it's conscious, he had another word for it. It doesn't matter. It can be conscious, it can be unconscious, but it's still dangerous. What you need is what's needed is an artistic expression of that. Now, that leads to the fifth point. And this is Nietzsche's main point, the main thesis of his whole book. It wasn't until the creation of Greek tragic theater and comic theater too, but he focuses mostly on tragedy, that the Apollonian and the Dionysian crisscrossed. The Apollonian had a wedding with the Dionysian. And so the Dionysian became Apollonianized. The Apollonian became Dionysianized. What do I mean by that? Well, they kept their purity, like two colors put close together. They both were what they were, but they offset each other because the relationship. So the relationship is what counts. It's like A and B, but B is not anything without A, and A is not anything without B if you see the whole thing. So the Apollonian and the Dionysian came together and it formed Greek tragedy and comedy. And if you look at the tragedy and analyze it according to these structures that Nietzsche's talking about, you'll find both. You'll find the Dionysian, you'll find the Apollonian. Because the tragedy itself is a dream. The plot, the music, everything. It's conjured up out of the dream work of the tragedians. By the way, the tragic writers knew music too. Every educated person knew music theory. You know, all music theory comes from the ancient Greek, the diatonic scales, the major, minor scales, the modes, all that. Modern music theater, Bach, everything, it all goes back to the ancient Greeks. And these Greek tragedians and comic writers, they were also composers of music, and they composed the music. But all of that, the music, the dance, the choreography, I'm sure a lot of other people worked together to do it, but mostly it was the tragedians. And then the actors actually enacted it and made the spectacle for the people. So the whole thing is a dream. And but there's Dionysian in it because there's the destruction of the individual, and there's music and there's dance, and but it's beautiful, even though everybody dies at the end. That's Dionysian, right? That's what a tragedy is. Such horrible things happen, but it's beautiful if you look at the whole thing. And by the way, everyone knows who's sitting in the audience, just like you know when you're watching a film, Silence of the Lambs or some horrible or some film like that. You all know that it's not real. So it's like dreaming, and you know you're dreaming. You know it's not real. If you're dreaming some horrible nightmare and you're not aware that you're dreaming, that's pretty close to psychosis. You know, that's pretty horrible, right? I mean, sometimes it happens, and then if you wake up and you don't even know if you're dreaming or awake, then that's it, you're bonkers. But so the very fact that everyone knows that it's a dream, that it's not real, that's the Apollinian part. That's important. That's the big difference. Like watching Gladiator at home or on the screen, and then actually being in the audience in ancient Rome and watching people get eaten up and finding pleasure at that. Then you're a sick puppy, right? So that's the big deal about the Apollinian, that it's not real. Okay. But it reflects reality in a deeper sense. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we can analyze a Greek tragedy or a comedy, and any art form, actually. Nietzsche wants to generalize it that far, but let's just focus on tragedy. And you'll see this mixture, this coming together of the Apollinian and the Dionysian. That's his main thesis in the book. Okay. Now, let's see, how many is that? The Dionysian, the Apollinian, the Dionysian without the Apollinian, the Apollinian without the Dionysian, and then the birth of tragedy. That's important. Why does he say out of the spirit of music? Because music is Dionysian and tragedy grew out of the chorus. If you follow Nietzsche, you'll see that at the beginning, the Greek tragedies were chorus only. Choros in Greek means singing ring dance. That's where we get our word the chorus, like in music. But at first it was dancing and singing in a circle and evoking the spirit of Dionysus. By the way, this is not just Nietzsche's point. If you did a careful study of the history of tragic theater, apart from Nietzsche, let's say you were studying to be a director and you were at Yale University where they have a major like that, and you were taking a course in the history of theater. Well, the book, if it were a responsible book, it could be independent of Nietzsche. The first chapter of that book on the history of tragic theater would have to be about how tragic theater was born of the cult of Dionysus that came from Thrace, an island in ancient Greece, and spread throughout the Greek world. And then it became more and more refined until finally you have the Euripides and Sophocles and so on. And then later Shakespeare and the great, and Pirandello and so many other, great theater writers. Okay, so that's the fifth. Let's see, what were they now? The Dionysian, the Apollinian, the Dionysian without the Apollinian without the Dionysian, and then the big thesis. That's the main thing. That's 5. 6. Now, this is an important one. I call this the existential import of Nietzsche's theory of the birth of tragedy. The existential import is this. Nietzsche's school of thought is called existentialism. He never called himself that, but since he emphasizes existence and life, then the scholars put him into that school, the intellectual historians. What is the existential import of tragic theater for Nietzsche? Well, what Nietzsche is saying is that the the audience who witnessed these tragedies, the audience of these tragedies in the amphitheaters who were watching this, they knew that it was not real, right? It's an art form. They knew that. But they suspend disbelief, as the literary critics like to use that expression, suspending disbelief. It's just a fancy word for saying, let's pretend it's real. right? That's, if you want to enjoy a film or something, you have to pretend like it's real. If somebody's talking or analyzing it, the acoustics or the technical, the cinematography, that bugs you, because not because they're talking, because they're pulling you out of the film. You're not into it. You want to get into it. So how do you get into it? You identify with it. It's like, let's pretend it's real. They call that suspending disbelief. So they were suspending disbelief, but in the back of their mind, they knew it was a dream, right? And so what's happening in these tragedies, horrible things happen, actually. But the whole thing is beautiful. The music is beautiful. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The parts fit together perfectly. It's an incredible art form. So what the audience is left with is awe, this awesome spectacle. They feel the sublimity, the awesomeness, this is how life is, they're thinking, they're feeling. They're thinking and feeling. This is how life is. It's horrible. And it's beautiful. It's awesome. And it's worthy of our affirmation. So there's this tragic affirmation that wells up in the audience, and they leave the theater thinking how awesome life is, how beautiful it is, how horrible it is at the same time, and how worthy it is of our affirmation. Okay? That's important because it takes the Greeks beyond pessimism into this tragic affirmation of life. That's the sixth theme. That's important. You want to find that in Nietzsche. Now, I added a seventh theme because I was thinking about how this might be related to self-realization, because that's a big theme in Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very much a philosopher of self-realization. What that means is how one becomes what one is. In fact, that's the subtitle of his autobiography. It's called Ecce Homo, which means behold the man. The subtitle is how one becomes what one is. And so Nietzsche thought that within all human beings, there's a certain potentiality. Just like in an acorn, there's a potentiality to become an oak tree. If that acorn lands on some fertile soil and it has some space to get some light and it germinates, it can become an oak tree. But not all acorns become oak trees. In fact, most of them don't. They fall on rocks, they fall too close to the other trees, and they just be eaten up by squirrels or something. So only a few become oak trees. So how does a human being become great? It's like a metaphor. How does an acorn become an oak tree? How is it that you can take these potentialities for greatness that are inside of us, and it's probably in a lot more people than we would think. It's in a lot more people than they would realize. How is it that they can blossom and blossom like a rose, like an oak tree? What are the conditions that make possible for the blossoming of greatness in human beings? How does one become what one is? It sounds like a paradox. How can you become what you already are, right? If you are something, the only way I can make sense of that is potentiality and actuality, how potentiality becomes actual. So how is it that we can relate his whole theory of art as he speaks of it in The Birth of Tragedy? By the way, he has a whole theory of art. Nietzsche is very much a philosopher, a friend of the artist, more than any other philosopher, I think. Not any other, but among a few philosophers that are really the friend of the artist, Nietzsche is there, and he's an artist himself. Actually, he writes a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is an art form. It's literature, and it's art. It's philosophy, but it's art also. So he proves himself as an artist also, and he writes poems too, and so he's definitely an artist. But he's also a philosopher. But he's also, he creates a philosophy of art. This is his early writings on the philosophy of art. Now, I tried to relate it to self-realization. And here's the connection that I made. And you can do that with this film, Alice in Wonderland, how Alice becomes Alice. but I'm not going to talk about the film right now. I just want to talk about the birth of tragedy. I'm going to leave it up to you. But let me give you a few hints. How does Alice become Alice? How does anyone become who they are? How do you become great at something in your life, where you're a force to be contented with in life, in something? You know, how does that happen to some people? How did Beethoven become Beethoven? In, well, Nietzsche thinks that you need to turn yourself into a work of art, turn your life into a work of art. You have to invent yourself, as people say. I mean, they throw that word around, reinvent yourself. And there's some truth to that talk, but it matters who's talking and who's saying it. By reinventing yourself, what Nietzsche means is to create yourself. Beethoven just didn't become Beethoven, he made himself Beethoven, just like you make anything. So what happens is you become the artist and you become the art form. It's a little bit like dance. You know, if you think about it, dance is the only art form where the human body, or maybe the body of animals too, if you believe animals dance, which I believe, but the body becomes the medium out of which the art form is made. No other art form is that way except dance. Well, voice too, I guess. Your breath becomes sound. So maybe singing. But any other art form, you're taking some other medium, strings for the guitar or the flute. And well, with the flute, it's also voice, it's also your breath, isn't it? Anyhow, we don't need to get into the details. But with dance, the body becomes the art form. And so what Nietzsche is saying is you become the artist and the art form at the same time. So all the things that he's talking about art, about tragic art, would be there. You need the Dionysian, you need the Apollinian, and you need the crisscrossing of both. Okay? You have to invent yourself, you have to dream up yourself. What does that mean? It means legislating your values. What matters to you? I believe in this, I believe this matters to me. Beethoven thought music matters. And so I will become a musician, a great musician. And so he takes something and makes it look easy. But when you go from difficult to easy, the artist makes things look easy, but you don't see all the difficulties and the overcomings of struggle that led to this ease. So, and also everything Nietzsche's been talking about then would be elements of self-realization. Only now you're the tragedian and or the comic writer, and let's just talk about the artist in general, and the art form itself. And at the heart of it all then is this affirmation of life, the affirmation of oneself, just like the audience. So you're like the audience, everything that goes into the tragedy that Nietzsche was talking about would become part of the process of self-realization. So for example, there's need of the Dionysian. Without the Dionysian, nothing great happens. I mean, I mentioned Beethoven in passing. Beethoven's music is Dionysian. It's powerful. Bum, 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 bum. It's Dionysus dancing. Without the Dionysian, without him breaking from Bach, there's no Beethoven. Wherever there's construction, there's destruction. So if he just followed Bach, then there would be no Beethoven. If Vincent van Gogh, if he followed the early Impressionists, there would be no Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh, I was corrected when I was traveling. I can't, it sounds like you're clearing your throat, but that's how you pronounce his name. So I'll leave that up to you to find out how it is that Nietzsche's discussion of art in the birth of tragedy can be related to self-realization. You need the Dionysian, but you need it tempered with the Apollinian. You need self-knowledge, but you need to forget yourself. You can realize yourself by forgetting yourself. That's an interesting, because you're going to be combining opposites: chaos, order, construction, destruction, pessimism, tragic affirmation. Opposites are going to belong in the same place. It's going to be the unity of opposites. So turn yourself into a work of art. Make every day into a work of art. And that's my talk on this early book of Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music, or The Birth of Tragedy, Hellenism and Pessimism. At the heart of it all is this doctrine of the love of life. Okay, thank you.